cooking with peanut oil. One thing to follow up on from last Sunday when we were talking about leaning into death. You know, what happens as Christians prepare for the inevitable, because we know it's appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. But one thought that was sort of left over from last Sunday that I'll touch on just briefly before we move to this Sunday's lesson is this idea of, are the dead conscious after death, and do they see what's going on earth? And you'll often see there'll be a football game and somebody will be like, my grandfather was watching from heaven, or whatever it is. Does the Bible teach anything like that? The number one term in the Bible used to describe death is what? Asleep. And what happens when you're asleep? You're not aware of anything. Solomon says in the book of Ecclesiastes, the dead know not anything under the sun. So if there's any level of consciousness after death, it's not consciousness of what's going on here under the sun. And think about it practically. Forget about your own family, because I'm sure they're all adorable, but think of other people's families. Do you think they'd really want to know what their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are doing? No, I don't think so. So I did want to just sort of briefly touch on that, and we're going to shift gears to something that's really a historical thing. But it's got to do with two men that are Christians. And two men who are Christians who save civil rights, who save trial by jury. The story has an Indiana connection because the man who had been tried without a jury was from Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was an attorney. There are a lot of attorneys in this story. I know we don't normally think of attorneys as heroes. I sometimes tell the joke, the difference between a skunk that's been hit by a car and a lawyer that's been hit by a car. The answer is there's skid marks in front of the skunk. You have to be a lawyer to tell that joke, right? But this is a story about lawyers who are people of substance and who are fighting for the things that are right. And we've had lawyers like that in our history. Martin Luther King's first attorney was a member of the Church of Christ. I was in Nashville, Tennessee about 10 years ago, and I was with two of the Freedom Riders, and they talked about what a handsome man that attorney was when it came to get him out of jail, right? When you're in trouble and you need a lawyer, the lawyer can look pretty good. And we've had lawyers in our history who did important things. And then you think about biography, and I love this quote. My friend Earl Kimbrough wrote a book about a preacher named F.B. Shrigley. And Earl said, I need some kind of quote for that first page of the book. Do you have anything that would work for F.B. Shrigley? And I happen to have just the thing. I had read this. So this is F.B. Shrigley writing in the 1930s. He said, I think biography is interesting. It is also profitable. Most of the history of the world is made up of what men and women have done. There is more space in the Bible given to Abraham and his acts than is given to the history of the creation of the world for 2,000 years. The good deeds of men should be related as an encouragement to others to do likewise. We should be motivated by the good that we see, and we should discard the evil. And none of us is perfect. We all make mistakes, but are we going to focus on those things that are negative? Or are we going to focus on those things that are positive? And I think as Christians, our goal should be to focus on those things that are positive. I'm teaching today, won't be teaching for 2 weeks, but then we're going to do 12 weeks on the life of Abraham. So we'll take what he says here to heart. I've been interested in biography since I was a teenager. I got more interested over time. And what do you do if you have an interest in something? You seek out people that have similar interests. And so from the time I was fairly young, I would seek out people who were writers and researchers and authors. And one of the people that I sought out back in 1996 was Earl West, who many of you knew personally. Yeah, he was the preacher for what was the Irvington congregation from 1943 to 53, and then Franklin Road from 1957 into the 1980s. And so after I moved to Indianapolis, I had read Earl West's Search for the Ancient Order, and I thought, here's a guy I'd like to meet. So what do? You pick up the phone and you call. And so Earl and I had lunch, and part of the things that I collect to understand history better are letters and correspondence. And often you find things in letters that are just not good, that are not encouraging, that are not inspiring, but every so often you find something that's not bad. This is a letter dated August 21st, 1996, and somebody's written Earl West and said, you ought to write a biography of Foy Wallace Jr. And Earl writes him back and says, I'm 76 years old now, so my ability time-wise to write a biography came to be questionable to me. There is a fine young man in Indianapolis who never knew Wallace, of course, but he's a diligent student of good spirit and great intellect. So he does appear to me. He wants to write this biography, and I told him to go ahead. I will help him all I can. He is me, Terry J. Gardner. Yeah, that's pretty good, isn't it, to find that in a letter? You expect sometimes to find things that are different. So that was Earl West. I actually did write the biography of Foy Wallace Jr. back in 1998. Michael Anderson asked me a few months ago, he said, do you know anything about this guy named Foy Wallace Jr.? I said, well, yeah, I was his biographer. I might know a little bit about him. Biography tells the story of people's lives. And today we want to spend a little bit of time on the life of Judge Jeremiah Sullivan Black. And Judge Black is from Pennsylvania, so we start with that. And Judge Black is a person of substance. He's from a family of substance. He's an important figure in our history. His father's homestead was a place called Pleasant Glades in Stony Creek Township, Somerset County, Pennsylvania. His grandfather was James, considerable property, a farmer and a justice of the peace. His father, Henry Black, was a justice of the peace and an associate judge. Jeremiah went to the schools of the neighborhood. He was keenly interested in Shakespeare and the Latin classics, and at 15 he committed the text of Horace to memory verbatim. That's a Latin text if you're not familiar with Horace. Once upon a time, if you go back 100 years, 200 years, everybody who was educated spoke Latin. So if you were traveling in Europe and you couldn't speak French, but you could speak Latin, you were still fine because any educated person in Europe spoke Latin. Everybody read Latin who was well educated. And so there are certain lines in the Latin classics that everybody knew. One of the lines in Caesar's commentary for the conquest of Gaul, which is the ancient name for France. Caesar conquers France, and he learned, like Winston Churchill, if you write your own biography, you're going to look a little bit better, when the book comes out. He begins that commentary by saying, all Gaul, all of France, is divided into 3 parts. This is a very famous thing if you study the Latin classics. It's so famous that when the musical Camelot came out, there's a scene where Lancelot, who's from what country? France. Lancelot is French, right? He's got that great song where he asks, who's the greatest guy that ever lived? And he's like, c'est moi, me. I am the greatest. He's Muhammad Ali before there's Muhammad Ali. He's the Frenchman. And Guinevere is like, he should take me to the ball because he's by far the best knight. And the other knights are like, that's nonsense. We'll take him on. We'll slice and dice him. And one of the knights says, and Gaul will be divided once more. He said, I'm going to take that Frenchman. I'm going to cut him into 3 parts. 75 years ago, people knew what that meant because people studied the Latin classics. Judge Black is studying the Latin classics. He's studying them on his own, by and large, right? He wants to know what they say, and he's taken with them enough that he memorizes what they say. I can't imagine memorizing Horace, but he had an affinity for it, and he was drawn to it. And so the 4 great literary influences on his life were Horace, Milton, Shakespeare, and the Bible, which is not a bad quartet. These were his exemplars, the models for his literary style. He has a great literary style. He writes clearly, he writes effectively, he writes with power, he writes in a way that makes you think, he writes in a way that draws the issue. Politicians in the modern day aren't too much interested in that because they're fearful of doing what? Offending someone. They don't want to lose votes, right? If I say something you disagree with, politicians are often, not always, but often fearful of losing votes. Judge Jeremiah Sullivan Black is not that kind of person. He's not built that way. He's built in a way where he wants you to understand what he said, and he's going to say it in as clear a way as he possibly can. At age 17, Jeremiah Sullivan Black entered the as a student, the law office of Chancey Forward. And Black was described as having a serious mind with its mighty and eager grasp, seized and assimilated everything within its reach. He read every book in his father's house and the house of his maternal grandfather, Patrick Sullivan. Black learned French and later Spanish. Another language of the educated was French for a long time. If you were considered educated, you wrote French. I read an article that George S. Patton Jr., the famous World War general, wrote to one of the French generals, and the letter is written in his own hand in French. Not great French, but he's conversant. Better French than I could certainly have ever done. Patton was an incredibly well-educated person. You know, we think of him from the movie as primarily being a crude, tough dude, and he certainly was all of that, but he's from a very wealthy family. He was very well educated. They spoke French. Black learned French and later Spanish. He learned Spanish because he has many cases in California law that have to do with the time that Spain had ruled and then Mexico had ruled California. So he needed to be able to read documents written in Spanish. So what's the problem? You just teach yourself to read Spanish. Chancey Forward was a distinguished attorney and leader of the Democratic Party, and although Jeremiah's family was a member of the Whig Party, that's WHIG, which is a precursor to what becomes the Republican Party, Jeremiah was a staunch Democrat. He defended that party and its principles, quote, with all the fervor of strong conviction and passionate attachment that he could intelligently espouse. Black was a disciple of Jefferson and a personal friend of Andrew Jackson. He's running in the high cotton, right? Most of us, you know, we're not running in that network. Those people aren't going to give us the time of day. If you knock on the door, they're not likely to answer. But Black is connected, and Black knows all of the people that are worth knowing for his time and day. Jeremiah Black is soon in practice with Chancey, whose oldest daughter, Mary Forward. He married on the 23rd of March, 1836. So now he's married. He's appointed Deputy Attorney General for the County of Somerset, and in 1842 he's named Chief Judge of the 16th Judicial District. In May of 1843, Jeremiah Black and his wife and 7-month-old son Henry and a nurse drive by wagon to Bethany, what's West Virginia now, was then Virginia. You may not realize this, there's no such state as West Virginia until 1863. West Virginia comes as a result of the Civil War. People in the western part of the state didn't want to be part of the Confederacy. And so Campbell's home, for most of his life, would have been described as being in the state of Virginia. But in 1863, it becomes West Virginia. This is a very famous painting of Alexander Campbell by Bogle. Makes him look a bit more handsome than he really was. I used to have a teacher in college who would say, I do not want justice from my photographs, I want mercy. And in the age where photography was mostly painting, right? There is no photography until 1839. A Frenchman named Louis Daguerre invents photography. So before 1839, you don't have the money to get your picture painted, nobody's going to know what you look like. So Louis Daguerre, a famous Frenchman, invents photography, and it's just an amazing story. If you like that kind of thing, look up Louis Daguerre and study how that work was done over 20 years to create photography. It's an amazing thing. But this is a very famous portrait of Alexander Campbell. And this is a letter that Campbell writes to Judge Jeremiah Sullivan Black in 1855. You may be saying, Terry, why do you care about Judge Black? I care because I acquired these 2 letters probably 15 or 20 years ago. And they're long letters, and they're written in Campbell's hand to Judge Black, and he's looking for help because there's the Democratic administration in power, and Alexander Campbell is the postmaster of Bethany, Virginia. Now, why do you think it would be important to be postmaster? Why would Campbell care about being postmaster? Because you had a really nice fringe benefit. It was called Free Frank. Free Frank meant you could sign your name on the envelope, and it would be mailed off at no charge to you. And what does Campbell publish? He publishes periodicals that go out every month, thousands of copies, and they all go out free. He publishes books that go out, thousands of copies. They're all mailed free. And so he has an interest in that. And because of the fact that he had studied the Bible with Judge Black, with those 4 people that I just told you about, goes from Pennsylvania. He drives to Campbell's home in Bethany, Virginia, which was not a simple journey at the time. And he wants to study the Bible. He realizes, I'm a married man now, I've got a family. There are a lot of people whose mind becomes much more serious about spiritual things when they have their own family. They start to think and reason about things that they should have been thinking about a long time before, and this is Judge Black. And so he goes over the hills and through the valleys, and he ends up at Bethany, Virginia, and he stays there with Alexander Campbell for 3 weeks studying the Bible. And at the end of 3 weeks, Alexander Campbell baptizes Judge Jeremiah Sullivan Black. And so for the rest of his life, Judge Black, when he was asked which church he belonged to, would reply, to the sect first called Christians at Antioch. That's S-E-C-T, to the sect first called Christians at Antioch. So he's a Christian. He becomes a Christian studying at the feet of Alexander Campbell. You know, I'm not sure what to equate that to in modern terms, but it would almost be like me calling up Billy Graham and saying, I want to come study the Bible with you for 3 weeks, and him making the time to do that. That's what a prominent person Judge Jeremiah Sullivan Black already is as a fairly young man. Well, in 1851, Judge Black is elected to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. He becomes its Chief Justice. Attorney David Paul Brown remarked in the 1850s on Black's ability to express himself in writing, saying, "The style of Judge Black and his composition is unlike any other with which we are acquainted. If we were asked what to say is its chief merit, we would say perfect clearness in which he exhibits his thoughts, whether right or wrong, that no man can misunderstand." On the 7th of March, 1857, James Buchanan is elected President of the United States. Buchanan will be the 15th president, and this is Campbell's study. There's Judge Black himself. Oops, we went one too far. So this is James Buchanan and his cabinet. Buchanan is the 15th president of the United States, and we all know who number 16 is, right? Most of us don't remember 15, but we all know that Abraham Lincoln is the 16th president. So Buchanan becomes president of the United States when the country has really fallen apart. You've got the disaster with John Brown and John Brown's execution that turns John Brown into a martyr. You know, Brown is going to go and free slaves, and he's caught and then executed by the government. And of course, that was probably the worst thing the government could have done, was execute John Brown, because they turned John Brown into a national folk hero. And people write songs about John Brown and how John Brown's body lies, you know, moldering away, and off we go. And the country is on edge in a way that in its history it's never been on edge before or since. And what's going to happen is, as Lincoln is elected and the southern states don't want to be part of the government anymore, the southern states begin to secede one after the other, starting with the states in the deep south and moving their way to states that are more northern. And so Judge Black is very well acquainted with James Buchanan, because he's going to serve as his Attorney General for 3.5 years. And this is the entire cabinet of James Buchanan. The government was definitely run on a much sparser basis in those days than it is today. And Judge Black will serve Buchanan and be devoted to Buchanan as long as Buchanan survives. 3.5 years in, there's a vacancy as Secretary of State, and Judge Black becomes the Secretary of State of the United States. Of course, in 1861, the Civil War begins. And the Civil War is the bloodiest war in our history by far. More casualties in that war than every other war we've been in combined. And you have brother fighting brother. You have a level of viciousness, particularly under the troops of William Tecumseh Sherman, that had never occurred in American history before. You have prisoner of war camps in both the North and the South. In Indianapolis, we have a camp called Camp Morton, that's incredibly brutally and awfully run, not too far from downtown Indianapolis. And of course, Andersonville, prisoner of war camp in Georgia, was infamous for the way that Northern troops were treated. It's a horrible, horrible time in our history. And Lincoln has one overriding goal in his presidency. And that overriding goal would be preserve the Union at all costs. And my view is if he had to keep slaves for another 500 years, if it would have saved the Union, Lincoln would have done it. Lincoln would have done whatever it took to preserve the Union. Does that mean Lincoln was not opposed to slavery? No. He's completely opposed to slavery. But he's got one overriding goal. That overriding goal is to save the Union, whatever it takes to save the Union. And so one of the things that Lincoln thinks is necessary is to suspend habeas corpus. And that's the ability to make people show cause as to why I have been arrested. If you followed the PGA golf tournament down in Louisville, there was a big brouhaha where Scotty Scheffler, one of I guess, the best golfer in the entire world, got arrested by a cop over something that, in retrospect, appears like it was just an absolute misunderstanding, right? But what happens when he's arrested? How long does it take him to be released from jail? Not very long, because he still plays his round that particular day. And one of the things the cop did in this particular case was charge Scheffler with a felony. That's called upcharging, right? In my view, completely immoral act to charge somebody with a felony who did not commit a felony, but that's what happens. But you also immediately have all of this focus of the public on Scotty Scheffler. Why? He's the #1 golfer in the world, and he's playing in this major golf tournament. And what kind of a lawyer do you think Scotty Scheffler gets? He gets a good lawyer, one who knows how to get things done. And part of the demand is you have to have probable cause, or you cannot arrest my client. You cannot charge my client. You can't do anything to my client. If you can't show probable cause, you've got to dismiss the charges. And of course, in fairly short order, all of the charges against Scheffler were dismissed, and they were dismissed with prejudice. With prejudice simply means they can't ever be refiled. That's the end of the matter. Sometimes things are dismissed without prejudice, which means that they can bring them back up. So Lincoln is determined to save the Union whatever it takes. Now, Lincoln, on a personal basis, is a very soft-hearted guy. We've all heard these stories about somebody, was going to be put in prison, and the wife came and told her sad story to Lincoln. And it seems like in these stories, Lincoln almost universally exercised mercy, right? But what do you have to do for that to work? I have to have access to the President of the United States, which was an easier thing then than it is today, for sure. But it still wasn't very easy. And so one of the things that happens is Lincoln suspends habeas corpus. I don't have to prove any reason at all for why I've got you arrested. I can arrest you for any reason or no reason. This is about preserving the Union. This is about preserving the Union. And Lincoln's feeling is that there are too many people that are opposed to his goal. And so he is going to suspend habeas corpus. And he does this by executive order. Does anybody know what executive order is? It bypasses pretty much everything. The president just issues a writ and says, this is what we're going to do, and as long as it's not unconstitutional, the president can do it. I was watching an interview with Lyndon Johnson, filmed 10 days before Johnson died, and Johnson, his greatest achievement of his presidency was what? I'd probably put that number 2. Number 1 would be, well, the Voting Rights Act, which is part of what kind of legislation? Civil rights. But before Johnson, if you're a person of color, your civil rights are not really protected by the federal government. And so he gets a series of civil rights laws passed. But the last one that he gets passed is the Fair Housing Act, and it's not passed until 1968. Johnson became president in 1963. It took him 5 years. And in this interview, he's being asked by the interview, why didn't you just do an executive order for fair housing? And Johnson said, I'm not a dictator, and I want to do something that will last. And he said, there's a right way to do things, there's a wrong way to do things. So executive orders have the force of law, and unless the Supreme Court steps in and says an executive order is unconstitutional, they stand. If you're a coin collector, you sometimes hear people talk about how Roosevelt seized all the gold. He did it by executive order. So Abraham Lincoln, by executive order, suspends habeas corpus. You can be arrested for any reason or no reason. Congress hasn't supported this. There's no law that supports this. Lincoln makes it up by executive order, which is the act effectively of a dictator. Now, Lincoln would have said, you know, we're at war and the future of the United States is at stake, and there are lots of justifications you can give for those actions, but nevertheless, this is what he does. Now, if you're critical of the government, you can be arrested. If you don't like the politics of the government, you can be arrested. If you look at things the wrong way, you can be arrested. If somebody doesn't like you and that person's in power, you can be arrested, and you can't call for a writ of habeas corpus. There is no get out of jail. You're stuck. And in that environment, along comes a man named L.P. Milligan, another Democrat. And by the way, it's an interesting fact that during the Civil War, Indiana is not really super pro the whole Civil War thing for much of the war. Right? We fight, obviously, on the side of the North, but we're a little more tepid than some of the other northern states is when it comes to supporting the Civil War. Well, there's a man named Lambden P. Milligan on the 5th of October, 1864. Milligan, who's an attorney, here we are with another attorney. He's an attorney in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And along with a man named William Bowles and Stephen Horsey, citizens of the state of Indiana, they're arrested by the order of Alvin P. Hovey, who's a major general. So what happens during the Civil War is military courts are set up. And these military courts are run by military officers, and they can bring you in for any reason or no reason, and they'll try you. And guess what the conviction rate is of the military courts? 100%. It's a miracle. It's amazing. Trials usually last for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And so Milligan and these other three men, Bowles and Horsey, citizens of the state of Indiana, are brought in to a military court in the state of Indiana. How many Civil War battles are fought on the grounds of the state of Indiana? None! How many Confederate soldiers are ever on the ground of the state of Indiana? For part of a day, at the southern extremity, there's a few Confederate troops. That's it. The civil courts are never closed. So think of this. I'm being arrested by a military court. The civil court's open. If I've done something wrong, if I violated the law, why am I not being arrested by the civil court? Why am I being drugged off to a military court to be convicted by a major general who always convicts everyone that's brought before him? Here were, quote, charges. Conspiracy against the government of the United States. No idea what that means. Affording aid and comfort to rebels against the government of the United States. He was pro-South. This is for sure. He's pro-South. But is my freedom of speech gone simply because we're in the middle of a civil war? Am I unable to say a favorable word about the South because we're in the middle of the Civil War? The answer is yes, because there's no such thing as habeas corpus. Inciting insurrection, disloyal practices, violation of the laws of war. He's an attorney in Fort Wayne, for Pete's sake. Well, he's tried by the military court. The military court convicts him in about an hour and a half, and Lambden and his two buddies, guess what the sentence is? Death! They're sentenced to be hung. They're sentenced to be hung for not liking what's going on and speaking out about it. And they appeal for habeas corpus, but there's no habeas corpus because Lincoln has eliminated it. Now, fortunately, for them, the Civil War is going well for the North. Sherman's taking Atlanta, and so a little bit of the wartime fever settles down a little bit, and so their sentences are commuted from being hung to being in prison for the rest of their life. How many people do you think are convicted who are civilians by military courts during the Civil War? Anybody want to hazard a guess? 38,000. 38,000 people. 38,000 people are convicted. And even worse, because Congress, a year after Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, they passed a law supporting what Lincoln had done, also completely unconstitutional. Because of that, we're now, after the war is over, it's now 1866, and now guess what? The military courts are still operating. You still look at somebody the wrong way, they don't like the color of your hair, and you can be hung. And in this setting, here comes Judge Jeremiah Sullivan Black. And Judge Black realizes this is an attack on every single American. No American is going to be safe if this is allowed to stand. But he also is a politician, right? You don't hold all the offices Judge Black held without understanding which way the wind blows. And so if he's going to attack this case, if he's going to take the case of poor Mr. Lambden and his two buddies, who are languishing in a federal prison in the state of Ohio, what's he going to need to be successful before the Supreme Court? He's going to need the right, not a bunch of people, but you need the right guy backing him, right? You need the right guy backing him. And the right guy is going to be an up-and-coming congressman, a former major general during the Civil War named James A. Garfield, a man who's a Republican, but a man who is a brother in Christ. Judge Black and James Garfield go to the same church in Washington, D.C. They know the same people. They have the same affinity for being a disciple of Christ. They've got the same belief in truth. They're simpatico in many ways. And so Judge Black reaches out to Garfield. And given what had taken place, the case that Judge Black is going to have is pretty simple. Number one, was Milligan entitled to a writ of habeas corpus? Number two, should Milligan be freed? Number three, did the military commission have jurisdiction to legally try and sentence Milligan? Black takes the case for free, and he goes to Garfield with his plea. And this is what's said. This is Garfield writing about this. Here Black came to me. He had seen what I'd said in Congress, and he asked if I was willing to say that in an argument in front of the Supreme Court. So this is Garfield. Black's approaching him, kind of testing the situation out. He sent me the facts in the case, the record. I read it over, and I said, I believe that doctrine. In other words, you can't just order people to be executed for no reason whatever because a military court convicts them when there are civil courts that are open. You have to have habeas corpus. Judge Black said to Garfield, young man, you know it is a perilous thing for a young Republican in Congress to say that. Why would it be perilous? Well, Garfield has the advantage of being a United States congressman, right? So he's probably not too worried about being thrown into jail. What are congressmen much more worried about? Losing the election. Their political career being destroyed, right? What Black is telling Garfield is, look, buddy, it's nice to have truth and right on your side, but it could cost you your career. Garfield replied, it don't make any difference. I believe in English liberty and English law. But, said I, Mr. Black, I'm not a practitioner in the Supreme Court. I've never tried a case in my life anywhere. So what had happened? James Garfield had been admitted to the bar, and then the Civil War starts. And Garfield knows that for 20 years after the Civil War, everybody elected president is going to be a veteran of the Civil War. And so Garfield goes to his church, be like me coming in today and saying, we're going to war. I need 100 people to come with me. And he recruited people to fight with him. He goes into the Army as a colonel, soon promoted to brigadier general and then major general, because he knows that everyone who's going to be successful in politics for 20 years after the Civil War is going to be a military officer during that war. So Garfield, he thinks a lot like a politician, but he's also a person of conviction. I believe in English liberty and English law, but I haven't been admitted to practice before the Supreme Court, and in point of fact, I've never argued a case before in my entire life. And Black says, how long have you been a member of the bar? And the answer is 6 years. You got to be a member of the bar 5 years to be admitted to practice before the Supreme Court. And so Judge Black says, not a problem. I'll take care of that. We'll get you admitted. And this begins a very lucrative legal career for James Garfield, because When they win this case, it's an unbelievable feather in their cap. And so he's admitted to the Supreme Court. He immediately entered upon the case, and Garfield spoke first to the court for 2 hours. So this is James Garfield to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1866. And understand, this is a court primarily of people that Abraham Lincoln appointed. They're not going to be favorable to the arguments. So here's what Garfield says. Garfield, the former Major General during the Civil War. He says, in Texas, Mississippi, Virginia, and other insurgent states, by order of the rebel president, won't even say his name. Who's the rebel president? Jefferson Davis. But Garfield doesn't say his name, the rebel president. The writ of habeas corpus was suspended, martial law was declared, the provost marshals were appointed to exercise military authority. This is what's going on in the South. But when civilians arrested by military authority petitioned for release by habeas corpus, in every case save one, the writ was granted. And it was decided there could be no suspension of the writ or declaration of martial law by the executive or by any other man except by supreme legislative authority. He's saying in the South, they tried to do exactly what Lincoln did, and in less than a day, everybody realized this was a bad idea and it's illegal, and so it stops. Garfield goes on and says, I've shown that Congress undertook to provide for all the necessities which the rebellion imposed upon the nation, and it provided for the trial of every crime imputed to the petitioners and pointed out expressly the mode of punishment. There is not a single charge or specification in the petition before you, not a single allegation of crime. He's saying Lambton and his two buddies are being held on totally bogus charges. There's not a single allegation of crime that is not expressly provided for in the laws of the United States. So if there is some crime they've committed, those crimes should be in the civilian courts. And if you can't allege them in the civilian courts, you cannot allege them. The courts were open during the trial, had never been disturbed by the rebellion. The military commission on the 10th day of its session withdrew from the room where it had been sitting, that the Circuit Court of the United States might hold its regular term in its own chamber. He's saying everything is going on normally here in Indiana. The civil courts are all open, and everybody understands that fact. For the next 10 days, the commission occupied by permission the chamber of the Supreme Court of the state of Indiana. This is how regular it all is. Everything is going on as it should. And then Garfield adds this. Such a doctrine, may it please the court, is too monstrous to be tolerated for a moment. I trust and believe that when this cause shall have been heard and considered, it will receive its just and final condemnation. 38,000 people, many of whom are hung for no reason. Your decision will mark an era of American history. The just and final settlement of this great question will take a high place among the great achievements which have immortalized this decade. It will establish forever this truth of inestimable value to us and to mankind, that a republic can wield the vast energy of war without breaking down the safeguards of liberty, can suppress insurrection and put down rebellion, however formidable, without destroying the bulwarks of law, can by the might of its armed millions preserve and defend both nationality and liberty. Victories on the field were of priceless value, for they plucked the life of the republic out of the hands of its enemies. But peace hath her victories, no less renowned than war, he quotes the poet. And if the protection of law shall by your decision be extended over every acre of our peaceful territory, you will have rendered the great decision of the century. And in fact, it is by far the most important civil rights case of the 19th century. Judge Black weighs in, following his young friend Garfield. He also had a 2-hour speech, and he said this: between the officers who have a power like this and the people who are liable to become its victims, there can be no relationship except that of a master and a slave. The master may be kind, the slave may be contented in his bondage, but the many who can take your life or restrain your liberty or despoil you of your property at his discretion, either with his own hands or by means of a hired overseer, owns you and can force you to serve him. All you are and all you have, including your wives and children, are his property. If my learned and good friend, the Attorney General, so Black now is referring to the current Attorney General, if my learned and good friend, the Attorney General, had this right of domination over me, I should not be much frightened, for I would expect him to use it as moderately as any man in all the world, but still I should feel the necessity of being very discreet. He might change in a short time. The thirst for blood is an appetite which grows by what it feeds upon. You cannot know him by present appearances. Robespierre, the architect of the French terror, the guillotining of thousands of people in France. Robespierre is the architect of this. Robespierre resigned a county judgeship in early life because he was too tender-hearted to pronounce a sentence of death upon a convicted criminal. Black is saying a man who at one point in his life is very tender-hearted, at another point in his life can have ice water in his veins and none of the mercy or kindness that we think would be part and parcel of a human being. Caligula, the great Roman emperor, passed for the most amiable young man before he was clothed with the imperial purple, and for about 8 months afterwards. So he seems like a swell guy, becomes the Caesar for 8 months, he seems like a great guy, and then just begins to reign of horrific terror. It was Trajan, I think, who said that absolute power would convert any man into a wild beast. If you decide that the Attorney General holds in his hands or shares with others the power of life and death over us all, and I will mean to be very cautious in my conversation with him. And I would warn you, the judge, who am I now addressing, to do likewise. Trust not to the gentleness and kindness which have always marked his behavior before. Keep your distance. Be careful how you approach him, for you know not at what moment or by what trifle you may rouse a sleeping tiger. Remember the injunction of Scripture. Go not near the man who hath the power to kill, and if thou come unto him, see that thou make no fault, lest he take away thy life presently, for thou goest among snares and walkest upon the battlements of the city. The right of the executive government to kill and imprison citizens for political offenses has not been practically claimed in this country, except in cases where commissioned officers in the armies were the instruments used. But why should it be confined to them? He's pointing out that these military courts had all been run by army officers. And so he says, why should it be confined to them? Shouldn't naval officers be permitted to share in it? What is the reason that common soldiers and seamen are excluded from participation in this business? No law has bestowed the right upon army officers more than other persons. And on he goes. A very eloquent speech, a long speech, a 2-hour speech that we were not going to read the whole thing with. But long story short is they win. They win. And as a result of that victory, Lambton and his 2 friends are freed from court, are freed from jail. Here's the young James Garfield, who does become president of the United States in spite of doing the thing where he acts with integrity. Help, back me up a little bit. All right, here we go. We'll stop with this slide. This slide is kind of fascinating, and I'll stop with this slide, but I'll also tell you kind of the rest of the story with Lambton P. Milligan. You'll notice there are 2 signatures under the picture of Judge Black. Anybody want to hazard a guess why there are 2 different, these are both Judge Black's signature, by the way. Both completely 100% genuine signatures. He lost use of an arm, didn't lose the arm, but he's in a railroad car traveling along, and there's a board from a train coming the other way that smacks into his arm and breaks his arm into many, many pieces. And while the arm is not amputated, he was never able to use it again. But in less than 6 weeks, he was writing as clearly with his left hand as he did with his right, but with a totally different script. I find that kind of its own amazing thing. All right, the rest of the story. Lambton, of course, has the perfect false arrest case. If anybody was ever false arrested, it was Lambton P. Milligan. And so he goes back to Indiana and he files suit against the government for false arrest, and he asks for $500,000. Can it go big, I guess is what he's thinking, which would be like, I don't know, $16 million today. It'd be a lot of money. And he gets an attorney named Hendricks. Does anybody know the name Hendricks? Your Hoosier history, he becomes Hendricks. His attorney becomes governor of the state of Indiana. So that's Milligan's attorney. The government, for its part, says, well, if they're going to have Hendricks, who's the best up-and-coming Indiana attorney we can get? And the answer is Benjamin Harrison. And so these two guys go at it now over the matter of civil damages. And who do you think is going to prevail? What happens after the Civil War ends? What does the attitude of Hoosiers become about the war? Obviously, it was a just cause. We were for it the whole time. You know, none of us were opposed to it, right? So essentially, Benjamin Harrison's argument is fairly simple, which is, yeah, he shouldn't have been sentenced to hang, and they shouldn't have had him in prison for 3 years, but he really was favorable to the South. And so, the case was won by Hendricks. The total damages were $5. And so justice ends in 1866, a lot like it ends in 2024. Thank you for your attention, and in 2 weeks, lessons from the life of Abraham.